Back up.
Yeah, he's exempted.
Get out of the street. Lock her up. Lock her up.
No, media is exempted. Media is exempted. Stop. Hi everybody, it's Anna Slatz, and I am in New York City, where some dramatic events have unfolded over the last 24 hours, as some of you may have heard. I was here in New York City trying to get some great footage and some great context for the Antifa riots and George Floyd protests that have been racking many US cities. As many of you know, I was in Washington, D.C. just before this. I was sent out by Rebel News just to get the real story and to see what was happening on the ground. Unfortunately, my plans were stifled, to say the least. After a short period of time covering the protests and even a little bit of the looting and destruction that happened here on the 2nd, I was arrested by NYPD. And I was arrested largely for filming them while they were taking down innocent bystanders who were just in the scene of the looting while letting the looters go and run free. I started the evening by marching with the Black Lives Matter protesters who had assembled. The protest was largely peaceful. When we got to Union Square, there was well over 2,000 people involved in the marching demonstration. No property had been destroyed. Nothing of that sort had taken place. But I got to witness a few interesting interactions that happened in Union Square between Black Lives Matter protesters. While some Black Lives Matter protesters were out there with their megaphones condemning any looting or destruction and requesting their fellow marchers not to promote or engage in that, some other Black Lives Matter protesters were suggesting that it was in fact a form of reparations and that they should be allowed to loot and pillage and destroy as much as they wanted to.
Someone goes and loots something, that's what's promised to them.
We're taking our own shit!
After the Civil War. So So we need to stop this whole bull about,
exactly.
we need to be peaceful, peaceful.
No, because all that's allowed them to do is to
Later on in the evening, there was a very interesting interaction I was witness to, but unfortunately could not get on my recordings, and that was between a young man who was involved in the march and some of the march's leaders. This young man was trying to discourage the marching line from heading up certain streets because he informed us that there were looters waiting in the dark and shady spots of those streets for the marching line to converge upon where they were so that the looting could begin. Looters had managed to actually rip down the plywood guard for the doors. As they were coming out, some were actually just throwing the clothes up into the air, just igniting even more chaos as people rushed to go and grab whatever they were throwing and dropping. One Black Lives Matter protester who was furious that anyone was looting the Zara began to get into physical altercations with the looters.
If you're here to protest police brutality, you will stop these looters! You will stop these looters right here! You will stand up to this guy infiltrating our roof! You're not a black ally! You're not an ally!
As I continued to film, the NYPD showed up. And when they did show up, of course the looters scattered, but rather than going for the looters, the people who obviously had handfuls of clothes, big backpacks full of merchandise that they had taken from the Zara, or even people who were coming out of the Zara in the broken glass entrance, they began just arresting random bystanders. People, perhaps, who they knew would not resist arrest, would not try to run, make their life a little bit easier. Oh my God. So the police are arresting. The police have just arrested somebody. I recorded one man who absolutely had nothing to do with the looting, brutally tackled to the ground, and NYPD shoved his face into the pavement while attempting to arrest him. Shortly after that, a swarm of NYPD began to brutally call out anybody who was even remotely close to the Zara, whether or not they had poor intentions or not, threatening to arrest all of them. I became a target for the NYPD. While I was holding up my press pass, clearly showing it and yelling out, "I am media," to all of the NYPD officers who looked my direction, I began to be brutally shoved around with a baton to my chest, telling me to go home, that I was past curfew, that I was breaking the curfew that exists here in New York, one that goes into play at around 8 p.m. every night. However, media is exempt from the curfew, just like essential workers such as those in healthcare or grocery or transportation. So I was yelling, media is exempt from the curfew. It's not exactly something I should have had to say to the NYPD, as they should know the laws that they are enforcing. After I took a baton to the chest, an NYPD officer grabbed me by the throat and threw me into the middle of the intersection.
Media is exempted! Media is exempted!
After stumbling my way to the next sidewalk on the parallel street, I was accosted by a police officer and a white-shirted lieutenant, who then demanded that I be arrested.
Media is exempted! The mayor said media is exempted!
Back off.
Media is exempted!
Get out of the street. Lock her up. Lock her up.
No, media is exempted! Media is exempted! Stop!
They then took me to Brooklyn Central Processing, where they put me in a cell that was maybe very generously measured at 5 feet by 16 feet, and there were 20 other women in the cell with me. We were literally back to chest, and these women were in tremendous amounts of pain. Some of them had injuries. Some of them had their cuffs on so tight that their hands were bleeding. Some of them had, big swollen fingers because they'd been wearing their zip ties or their metal cuffs for hours and hours and hours. It included 2 healthcare aides who had been arrested while caring for their client, their patient. It was a woman with lupus who had a catheter in her chest for another condition. And they told me how their patient had literally been begging the NYPD not to arrest them because she needed help with her catheter and with her medications and so on. They arrested these 2 girls for being out past curfew, and they charged them with burglary. There was a 12-year-old boy in the male cell that was directly beside the female cell, measured exactly the same, perhaps with even more bodies in it. He was 12, a 12-year-old boy, and he looked 12. He was so short and tiny, with such big eyes. I'll never forget how scared he looked. At around 3:30 a.m., I was transferred from Brooklyn Central Processing to Manhattan Central Processing, where I got to experience yet another booking. This time, one that included a full search of my person in a pretty degrading way. And I was put in a cell that was, very similar in condition to the one that I experienced in Brooklyn. It was overcrowded. When I got in there, it made 9 women that had to share those 3 metal benches to try to get some semblance of sleep. Of course, I never slept. While in Manhattan, they refused to give people phone calls. There were a few women that I shared a cell with who routinely broke down thinking about how they weren't able to contact their families. And when they told me how long that they had been in that cell, I was in shock. Some of those women had been in there, including a pregnant woman, had been in there for 7 days. I actually started to lose hope at one point that I would ever be released because what was supposed to be a very quick processing where I had my charge and I spoke to a judge and it would get ultimately dismissed turned into a fear that I would be forgotten like the rest of those women were. The rest of those women who, by and large, after speaking to so many of them, had never been involved in the protest or the looting and were just standers-by that the NYPD just happened to be able to grab. These were just anybody they could grab, anybody at arm's reach who would comply and who would disappear through the system. After I was released from Manhattan Central Processing, I was actually greeted by some strange bedfellows. The National Lawyers Guild, which is a pretty infamous group, charity, that mostly handles Antifa legal support, was actually waiting for me outside the back entrance of the prison that they snuck me out of. They said, "Oh, you're Anna Slatz." Yes, I am. They very kindly drove me to Brooklyn, where my items were still in holding. I'm not going to stop covering riots or marches. I'm not deterred by what the NYPD did to me. I am emboldened, I am strengthened, and I will continue to do what it is I feel like I do best, and that is get right to the heart of the action and show you what is happening on the ground wherever you want to see it. But I want to thank you all for showing me such a tremendous amount of support during a really desperate and scary moment in my career. I also want to thank my employer at Rebel News, who continued to fight for me behind the scenes, even though I was unaware of it most of the time, just because of how cut off I was from the rest of the world. But there were so many things being done that were all aimed at trying to get me out as fast as possible. There was a website established while I was in called Save Anna Slatz, and if you'd like to continue to support me, you can visit that website. You can visit stopantifa.com, which is where I've put the majority of my riot coverage so far from Washington, D.C. So this is Anna Slatz in New York City, a free woman, once again, and going to be back up to my old antics very, very soon. Have a good night, guys. If you enjoyed this video, and if you enjoyed my coverage here from Washington, D.C., you can go to stopantifa.com to donate to my travel expenses. Please also like and subscribe to Rebel News on YouTube. Thank you.